Hey guys, and welcome back to Kingdom Students. My name is Brian, and I have the honor to serve as the student pastor here at Kingdom Life. Now, as you've probably already figured out, today is another small group Sunday, but I want to do something a little bit different. If you've been challenged or encouraged over anything that you see in Kingdom Students or have seen over the past few months, I want you to share that with your friends. They may go to Kingdom Life, they may not, but I really want to encourage you to share both the large group messages and the small group devotions with your friends so that they can be encouraged and challenged as well. Now, this is the first small group Sunday in a brand new series that we're in called Feedback. And this is a series that is going to continue to walk us through the book of Judges. But on Sunday, we talked about the fact that there are two kinds of feedback. There's good feedback and there's bad feedback. See, one of the bad types of feedback is when you're listening to somebody using a microphone or listening to a speaker and you get that high-pitched squealing sound. That's the bad kind of feedback. But if you're listening to somebody that they're encouraging you, they know what's going on in your life, and they want to challenge you to be better or to improve at whatever you're doing, that's a good kind of feedback. And when we kicked off this series, we were talking about this guy named Abimelech. Now, we kind of hinted a little bit about Abimelech a couple of weeks ago, but Abimelech was Gideon's son. It was actually Gideon's son as the result of an affair, and it was from Gideon's servant that lived in this town called Shechem. Now, that's really important because it comes into play with the story that we read on Sunday. See, Abimelech recognized that he needed some help to have any shot at being the king of Israel. And that was kind of his goal. Abimelech recognized that if he kind of went to the leaders of Shechem and said, hey, I'm for you, I'm from you guys, like you guys are my family, this is my hometown. If you help me become king of Israel, then it'll go well for you because you kind of are related to the new king. And so he talked the leaders of this town into financing his campaign, as it were, for the kingship of Israel. Now, when I say campaign, I don't mean he had posters printed and he had speeches to give. I mean, he recognized that there were other people in line to be king that most of Israel would want over him. In fact, there were 70 other people, and he recognized that he would have to get rid of these people in order to be king. And so the leaders of Shechem financed Abimelech's ability to hire essentially mercenaries to kill his brothers. Right? This escalates really quickly. Judges is kind of a weird, gory, and bloody book, and this is one of the stories within it. And so Abimelech goes out and he tries to kill all of his brothers that are the sons of Gideon. And he gets most of them, but he misses one guy. He misses this guy named Jotham. And Jotham recognized that he had two choices. One, he recognized he was a wanted man, right? He could run and hide and kind of try to find a place to hide out for the rest of his life, and hopefully Abimelech wouldn't come after him. Or he could challenge the leaders of Shechem, the ones that financed this whole genocide of Gideon, and he could challenge them and say, what you have done was not right. And that's what he did. He found a mountaintop close to Shechem, and he gets up on the mountaintop and he begins to shout down toward the leaders of Shechem. And he tells them this parable. He tells them this kind of weird parable of the trees and the fact that the trees were looking for a king, and they asked all these different plants, and the only one that said yes was the bramble. And we talked about what that meant, what a bramble was. It's what, if you grow up in the country, you might know as briars or a briar patch, right? So this parable says that the trees elected the briar patch to be their king, and as a result, things didn't go well for the trees. And this parable is directly correlated, directly paralleled to the leaders of Shechem, because he goes on to explain that the leaders of Shechem did not have integrity when they recruited Abimelech to be their king, and as a result, two things were going to happen, because this is not God's plan. So the first thing that was going to happen was that the leaders of Shechem would be kind of consumed by this new king, this person that was not in God's will, being king over Israel. And the second thing that was going to happen was that the king would be destroyed by the people of Shechem. So he basically told the leaders of Shechem, because you did this, you guys are going to destroy each other. And that's what happened. We talked a little bit about what happened to Abimelech at the end of that. And you might be wondering, this is all kind of weird and maybe a little bit interesting, but what does it have to do with me in 2021? Well, this is what we talked about on Sunday, the fact that we all have the ability to either accept or reject feedback. And Israel was kind of caught in this loop of negative feedback. They were listening to leaders that weren't godly, they were doing things that weren't godly, and therefore they were electing more ungodly leaders. And we talked about how this can kind of even snowball in your life. And so there's a couple of questions that I want you to think through when I want you to ask of yourself. I want you to ask your family, and maybe even ask some of your friends as you go through this week and spend some time just reflecting on what God has to teach us through this kind of weird and obscure text in Judges. So here's the first question I have for you. Have you ever been manipulative to get something that you wanted? Because after all, this is how this whole story starts, with Abimelech being manipulative to the people of Shechem in order to get something that he wants. And he thinks things are going to go great. He thinks things will work out for him. But in the end, they don't work out for him. And he may even have thought that he was doing the right thing because people approved. People agreed with what he was doing. After all, when he approached the leaders of Shechem, they said okay, and they financed his plan to kill his brothers. And so that kind of leads us to the second question for you today, is that have you ever gotten approval from someone for doing something that wasn't godly? Now, I know this is a question that can really spark some conviction and maybe some confession if you're walking through some of these questions with your parents. And I want to encourage you, lean into this question, right? Because I think there are always times in your life and in my life where we can think that we're doing the right thing because somebody gave us approval. But just because someone gives you their approval, it does not mean that what you were doing was godly. It doesn't mean that what you were doing is a part of God's plan. And so I really want you to kind of think through this question. Have you ever gotten approval for something, and then maybe in the moment you didn't realize it, but later you realized, hey, this is not really what I should be doing. This is not something that's godly, or it's not something that is a part of God's plan for me. Maybe it's not inherently sinful, but it's not a part of God's plan. That falls under this category as well. So moving on to the third question. Why do you think we choose to go our own way instead of trusting in God's plan? This is how these second and third questions kind of correlate together, because we have a tendency to want to look for approval for our plan, right? We very rarely kind of instinctively want to go with God's plan. And that's because God sees things that we don't see. God knows things that we don't know, and as a result, He has a plan that's different than what you or me might choose for ourselves. And so I want you to think through this question. Why do you think we choose our own way instead of actively seeking God's plan for every area of our life? Now, here's the fourth question for you today. What was the one thing that Jotham said God's plan always includes? Now you might have to go back to the text for this question, and if you do, that's okay. I'll actually kind of unpack it for you in just a second. But when we are looking toward God's plan for our life, there's one thing that is always present in His plan, and that may be present in your plan, but it may not be. And that thing that Jotham told the leaders of Shechem, God's plan always includes. It's a word that starts with I. It's a word that isn't necessarily very frequently seen in our culture. That word's integrity. See, Jotham told the leaders of Shechem that if you were walking in integrity, you would not have allowed this to happen because of Abimelech, because you would have recognized that Gideon gave so much to you, and if he gave so much to you, you would not finance the murder of his sons. And so he challenged them and said, hey, you're not walking in integrity when you're walking with this guy. And so we have to recognize that in our lives, integrity is a big deal. God's plan for your life will always include integrity. So if there's anything shady about something that you feel like you might be called to do, I want to really challenge you and see if you've thought this through. Is integrity a part of this plan? Because if integrity is not, it's not part of God's plan for you. Now, here's the last question that I'm going to leave you with today. Why should we always choose integrity, even if things don't necessarily work out the way we want? Because this is how we ended this text on Sunday. We ended the text with Jotham recognizing that he was not going to get a resounding round of applause for his parable. People weren't going to say, you know what, you're right. Maybe I shouldn't have hired this guy to kill you and your brothers. No, they recognized that this was one of Gideon's sons, that he stood in the way of Abimelech becoming king, and as a result, he needed to be eliminated. And so they went after Jotham, and he kind of took off and had to hide anyways. But he recognized that God still called him to challenge these leaders, because God's plan is all about having integrity. So why should we choose that path even when things don't work out? I want you to think through that. And I'm not saying that there's a good reason to not choose God's plan. I'm just saying I recognize the temptation that might exist to say, well, if integrity means that things aren't going to work out for me, I'm going to choose the path that doesn't include integrity so that things work out for me. I want you to kind of reject that possibility outright, because after all, if God's plan chooses integrity, and what's the saying at Kingdom Life? The best life is to live life God's way. Then even when things don't initially work out when we choose integrity, God's plan is better than our plan. Now, I hope these questions are challenging and to you, and it helps you kind of really wrap your minds around the story of Abimelech. And we'll be back next Sunday with another large group message. This will be week 2 of feedback, and we can't wait to see you guys then. Until then, I want you to also remember that we have our one-night service this coming Wednesday. It's going to be at Simpsonville First Baptist Church, and we would love to have you guys come out and hang out with us for that. I mentioned this and kind of teased this out on last Wednesday, but there's a huge giveaway for the one-night service, and we really want to encourage you guys to be a part of that. If you want to know what that giveaway is, go back and watch last week's Wednesday night video, and you'll see what the giveaway is there. So thanks for hanging out with us today, guys. We can't wait to see you guys at one night, and we can't wait to see you guys next week for week 2 of feedback. Have a great day.
It's not a game, it's a rich thing.